How could 129 men disappear without leaving a single survivor to tell their story? In 1845, the British Empire launched what many believed was the most capable Arctic expedition ever assembled. Two specially reinforced ships carried 129 carefully selected officers and sailors into the frozen north, backed by years of planning, experienced leadership, and enough provisions for a prolonged voyage. Nothing about the mission suggested failure. It represented the confidence of a nation convinced it had finally overcome the challenges that had defeated generations of explorers. Yet within only a few years, every man had vanished. No survivor returned. No complete journal explained the crew's decisions. No eyewitness remained to tell the expedition's final chapter. What should have become one of the greatest triumphs in the history of exploration instead became one of its greatest mysteries. For decades, the Arctic revealed only fragments of the truth. Search expeditions uncovered a small cemetery preserved in the permafrost, a handwritten message hidden beneath a stone cairn, abandoned equipment scattered across the frozen landscape, and human remains that hinted at unimaginable suffering. Individually, none of those discoveries explained what had happened. Together, they suggested that the answers had not disappeared. They had simply been scattered across the Arctic. Over the next century and a half, historians, archaeologists, forensic scientists, and the knowledge preserved by Inuit communities gradually assembled those fragments into one of history's most remarkable investigations. Today, we know where the expedition became trapped, why the ships were abandoned, and many of the hardships the crew endured during their final months. But understanding what happened is not the same as understanding how one of the best prepared expeditions of its time collapsed so completely. To answer that question, we have to return to the beginning, before the ice, before the disappearances, and before the Franklin expedition became one of history's greatest mysteries. Only by understanding the confidence with which those men sailed north can we truly understand the scale of what was lost. By the middle of the 19th century, one prize had eluded every major naval power for centuries. The Northwest Passage promised a navigable route between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, offering enormous commercial and strategic advantages to whichever nation discovered it first. For Britain, finding that route meant more than expanding trade. It was an opportunity to reinforce its position as the world's dominant naval power by completing one of the last great challenges of the age of exploration. Few men seemed better suited to lead that mission than Sir John Franklin. After decades of Arctic service, he had earned a reputation as a determined and experienced explorer capable of leading men through some of the harshest conditions on Earth. Although he was approaching 60 years of age, his appointment inspired confidence rather than concern. To the British public, Franklin was not embarking on a desperate gamble, but on the expedition many believed would finally succeed where others had failed. That confidence extended beyond the man in command. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror had already proven themselves in polar conditions before being extensively refitted for this mission. Their reinforced hulls, experienced officers, modern equipment, and carefully planned supplies reflected years of preparation. Every major lesson learned from previous Arctic expeditions appeared to have been incorporated before the ships ever left England. When the expedition departed in May 1845, families expected their sons, husbands, and fathers to return as heroes. Newspapers followed the voyage with enthusiasm, and there was little reason to believe it would become anything other than another remarkable chapter in Britain's history of exploration. 2 months later, Whaling ships encountered Erebus and Terror in Baffin Bay. The crews appeared healthy. The ships were in excellent condition, and after a brief exchange, the expedition continued north, exactly as planned. No one could have imagined that this ordinary meeting would become the last confirmed sighting of every one of those 129 men. After the ships disappeared beyond the Arctic horizon, the Franklin expedition entered a chapter of history that would remain hidden for generations. After disappearing beyond the reach of the outside world, the Franklin expedition entered the chapter of its history that would remain hidden for generations. Archaeological evidence now shows that the ships reached Beechey Island, where the crew spent the winter of 1845 and 1846. At first, nothing suggested that disaster was inevitable. Like other Arctic expeditions before them, the men settled into familiar routines, conserving supplies and waiting for warmer weather to loosen the ice. Even so, the first warning signs had already appeared. During that winter, 3 young sailors died and were buried on Beechey Island, where their graves remain preserved in the permafrost to this day. Historians still debate the exact cause of their deaths, but those graves became the first clear indication that the expedition was facing challenges far greater than anyone in Britain could have imagined. When the ice finally loosened, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror continued south toward King William Island. There, in September 1846, they encountered the obstacle from which they would never recover. Both ships became trapped in the sea ice. At first, this was not unusual. Arctic expeditions often expected to spend an entire winter frozen in place before continuing their journey the following summer, and Franklin's expedition had been prepared for exactly that possibility. But when summer finally arrived, nothing changed. The ice refused to release the ships. Another winter followed, and the crew slowly realized that what had begun as a temporary delay had become a crisis with no obvious escape. As the months passed, every advantage the expedition had carried into the Arctic began to disappear. Food stores steadily declined. Fresh sources of nutrition became increasingly scarce. Disease weakened the crew, and the psychological burden of isolation grew heavier with each passing season. Without a battle, without a violent storm, and without a single catastrophic event, the Arctic was slowly dismantling one of the most carefully prepared expeditions of its time. The situation became even more desperate on June 11, 1847, when Sir John Franklin died. The date survives in the expedition's final written message, but almost everything else about his death remains unknown. No witness described his final days, no journal recorded his illness, and no medical report explained the cause. The leader chosen to conquer the Northwest Passage disappeared into history almost as completely as the expedition he commanded. Responsibility now fell to Captain Francis Crozier. He inherited an impossible situation. The ships remained imprisoned by the ice. Another winter was approaching, and every available option carried enormous risk. The decision he made over the following months would determine not only the fate of the remaining crew, but also the final chapter of one of history's greatest Arctic mysteries. By the spring of 1848, the expedition had reached the point where every possible choice carried the risk of death. Remaining aboard the ships meant waiting for ice that had shown no sign of breaking. Leaving them behind meant crossing hundreds of miles of frozen wilderness with little certainty that help could be reached before food, strength, or time ran out. Faced with those impossible alternatives, Captain Francis Crozier and Captain James Fitzjames made the decision that would define the expedition's final chapter. They abandoned HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, leading the surviving men south toward the Back River in the hope of finding rescue. We know this decision was made because of a single, extraordinary document. Years after the expedition disappeared, search teams discovered a handwritten message hidden inside a stone cairn at Victory Point. It remains the only official record left behind by Franklin's officers, revealing that Sir John Franklin had died the previous year, that 24 officers and sailors were already dead, and that the surviving crew had abandoned the ships only days before the note was written. From that moment onward, the written record ends. Everything we know about the expedition's final months has been reconstructed from the evidence scattered across the Arctic. Search parties discovered abandoned boats filled with supplies, clothing, tools, and personal belongings that exhausted men had dragged across the ice before finally leaving them behind. Those discoveries reveal not a crew consumed by panic, but disciplined sailors who continued fighting for survival long after success had become unlikely. The Arctic gradually stripped away every advantage the expedition had once possessed. Carefully planned supplies became impossible to carry, essential equipment turned into dead weight, and even treasured personal belongings were abandoned as survival took priority over everything else. Every mile demanded another sacrifice, pushing the remaining men closer to the limits of human endurance. Some of the most disturbing evidence emerged many decades later, when forensic examinations of human remains revealed cut marks and fractured bones consistent with survival cannibalism. Today, most researchers consider this compelling evidence that at least some members of the expedition resorted to the unimaginable after every conventional means of survival had been exhausted, rather than reducing the story to a single, shocking detail. Those findings revealed just how desperate their final days had become. By the time the last members of the Franklin expedition disappeared, no one remained to explain the decisions they had made or the route they had taken. All that survived was a trail of evidence scattered across the Arctic, waiting for future generations to assemble the final pieces of the puzzle. For decades, solving that puzzle seemed almost impossible. Search expeditions crossed thousands of miles of the Arctic looking for survivors, journals, or any clue that could explain the expedition's fate. Instead, they found scattered artifacts, isolated human remains, and fragments of evidence that raised as many questions as they answered. Some of the most valuable clues came from a source many early investigators failed to appreciate. Inuit communities had preserved detailed accounts of starving European sailors, abandoned camps, and ships trapped in the ice. They described men pulling heavy boats across the frozen landscape and even spoke of vessels that had eventually disappeared beneath the water. At the time, many of these accounts were dismissed because they conflicted with European assumptions. Decades later, they proved to be remarkably accurate. As the 20th century progressed, archaeology and forensic science began confirming those accounts. Artifacts were recovered from locations described in Inuit oral history. Human remains revealed new details about the crew's condition, and advances in scientific analysis allowed researchers to understand evidence that earlier generations simply could not explain. The Franklin expedition was no longer being reconstructed through speculation alone. It was being rebuilt through evidence. The greatest breakthrough came in 2014, when archaeologists finally located HMS Erebus beneath the waters of the Canadian Arctic. 2 years later, HMS Terror was discovered in extraordinary condition, resting silently on the seabed after nearly 170 years. Those discoveries transformed the investigation, allowing researchers to examine the expedition through the ships themselves, rather than relying only on the scattered traces left across the Arctic. Today, every expedition to those wrecks adds another piece to the story. Although some questions may never be answered with complete certainty, the Franklin expedition is no longer remembered simply because 129 men disappeared. It endures because nearly 2 centuries later, the search for the truth is still revealing new discoveries. The Franklin expedition was not destroyed by a single catastrophic event. It was defeated gradually, as every advantage its crew carried into the Arctic disappeared one by one. Confidence gave way to uncertainty. Careful planning gave way to impossible decisions, and the technology that once symbolized Britain's ambition proved no match for an environment that refused to yield. For nearly 2 centuries, people remembered the Franklin expedition because 129 men vanished without explanation. Today, we remember it for something else. It has become one of history's greatest examples of how the truth can survive even when the people who lived it do not. Archaeologists, historians, forensic scientists, and Inuit communities each recovered a different piece of the story, revealing that the greatest discoveries are often not made in a single dramatic moment, but through decades of patience and evidence. Today, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror still rest beneath the waters of the Canadian Arctic. Every expedition to those wrecks has the potential to answer questions that have remained unanswered since 1845. And perhaps that is why the Franklin expedition continues to fascinate us. It reminds us that history is rarely lost forever. Sometimes it simply waits beneath the ice for someone willing to keep searching.